This single photograph remains as one of the most unsettling relics ever preserved, a silent witness, a frozen image that captures the shadow of one of the darkest crimes carried out in the name of faith. What you see here is not merely a picture, but a doorway into a story deliberately buried for centuries. A story spoken only in hushed tones inside confessionals, whispered in cloisters, and hidden away in the forbidden manuscripts of the Church's own secret vaults. But today, we will force open that sealed door. We will revisit the Convent of St. Magdalene, a place where silence became a tomb, where belief merged with blasphemy, and where, in the year 1811, an entire community of nuns vanished from history as though swallowed by the earth itself. The year 1811 was not an ordinary year for Europe. It was a time when the continent trembled under the weight of war and change. Napoleon's armies cast their shadow across kingdoms, rewriting borders with blood and fire. Monarchies that had reigned for centuries now swayed on their fragile thrones. Even the Catholic Church, once the untouchable authority of the Western world, felt the foundations beneath it cracking, its influence questioned in a way it had not been for centuries. Amid this upheaval, convents offered something that seemed timeless. They were havens of peace for the faithful, places of refuge for women escaping the heavy hand of forced marriages, the despair of poverty, or the suffocating secrets of their families. Within those stone walls, women could disappear from the world and claim sanctuary in devotion. The Convent of St. Magdalene was one such place. Remote, almost forgotten, it stood far from the prying eyes of secular authorities. About 80 nuns lived within its walls, ruled with firm discipline by the Mother Superior, Sister Caterina. At first glance, it was no different from countless other convents scattered across Europe. A life of prayer, obedience, and sacrifice, or so it appeared. Yet St. Magdalene was not what it seemed. Its walls hid something that set it apart, something darker than devotion, heavier than prayer. For decades, those stones guarded a secret so dangerous that when it was finally revealed, the Church had only one response, a punishment so extreme that history itself almost recoiled from recording it. The first spark came in March of 1811, in the form of a letter. Anonymous. Hand-delivered to the bishop responsible for the region. Its words were vague, yet heavy with accusation. Within the Convent of St. Magdalene, it claimed, ungodly acts were unfolding, ceremonies and practices that mocked the sanctity of faith. There were no names, no dates, no detailed accounts, but the hints were damning enough to pierce the bishop's attention. What could truly be happening inside those cloistered halls? The historical record is frustratingly incomplete. Many documents were destroyed, deliberately erased. Yet the fragments that survived tell a story as disturbing as it is undeniable. According to files preserved in diocesan archives, the convent had become more than a house of prayer. It was home to a secret brotherhood, or rather, a sisterhood bound together by ritual. The nuns, it seems, had founded a hidden society, weaving together Christian liturgy with rites far older than the Church itself. Their ceremonies, held deep in the convent cellars, were not the solemn prayers of monastic life but midnight gatherings where ancient spirits were invoked and forgotten gods were honored. These were not minor breaches of discipline, not harmless acts of disobedience. They were a merging of the holy with the forbidden. The records speak of fertility rituals echoing back to pre-Christian tribes, invocations in dead languages, and even sacrifices animals at first, but, if the darkest whispers are to be believed, sometimes abandoned children smuggled in under cover of night. And at the heart of it all was Mother Superior Caterina herself. She was not simply complicit. She led. A woman of noble blood, descendant of one of the region's most ancient families, she carried with her knowledge passed down long before Rome had set its cross upon those lands. In her view, there was no contradiction in serving both Christ and the gods of her ancestors. To her and to her followers, truth was older than Christianity, and to deny the past was to deny the fullness of God himself. When word of this reached the bishop, he was horrified. But he was also cautious. He could not simply storm the convent that would risk alerting the women, and worse, risk scandal that could shake the already fragile authority of the Church. Instead, he turned to deception. He ordered a covert investigation. 2 priests were stripped of their robes, disguised as simple pilgrims in search of rest and shelter, and sent into the convent to observe what no one else could see. What they uncovered in the days that followed would exceed even the darkest fears of the bishop. The two priests, clothed as weary travelers, crossed the convent's gates without suspicion. To the sisters of St. Magdalene, they were simply pilgrims, seeking a roof for the night and bread for their journey. But their real purpose was far more sinister: to witness, record, and expose. For a week they remained hidden in plain sight, silently watching, carefully noting every sound, every ritual, every strange flicker of candlelight that emerged from the convent's depths after nightfall. What they discovered was not rumor but confirmation of the accusations. In their secret journals, later smuggled back to the bishop, they described midnight gatherings in subterranean chambers, ceremonies cloaked in shadows, where the nuns stood in circles chanting in languages no priest could recognize. Altars bore not crucifixes but carvings of symbols older than Christianity. Firelight flickered against walls adorned with strange sigils, while voices rose in invocation not to Christ or Mary, but to beings whose names the Church had long forbidden. Yet that was only the beginning. Beneath the convent, the priests discovered something even more disturbing: a labyrinth of tunnels. Some had been carved out centuries earlier, others were natural caverns stretching deep into the earth. Within these tunnels were hidden chambers filled with pagan relics, stone idols, and arrangements of human bones carefully placed in ritual patterns. Dust-covered manuscripts, banned texts filled with heretical lore, lay stacked in alcoves like a forgotten library of the damned. One entry in their report noted that these books contained prayers not meant for salvation, but for summoning invocations that blurred the line between worship and witchcraft. The priests returned to the bishop with their findings, shaken to their core. What they had witnessed was, in their eyes, undeniable proof that the convent had become a nest of heresy and corruption. The Convent of St. Magdalene, once a house of God, was now a sanctuary of the forbidden. The bishop's dilemma was immediate and profound. To make the investigation public, to prosecute these women openly, would risk scandal that could devastate the Church's already weakened reputation. Europe was watching, doubting, questioning. To expose a convent as a place of pagan ritual and blood sacrifice could fan the flames of rebellion and anti-clerical fury. And yet, doing nothing was equally dangerous. If he transferred the nuns to other convents, the infection, as he called it, would spread like a plague. He needed a solution that was final, absolute, and secret. It was then that the bishop turned to precedent, to the cruel memory of the Inquisition, where heresy was purged not with words, but with fire, stone, and silence. He concluded that the only way to contain the darkness of St. Magdalene was not through trial, nor exile, but through isolation. A purification by immurement. The plan was simple in its cruelty. The nuns would be entombed alive within the very convent they had corrupted. Their prison would become their coffin, and their prayers, if any remained, would echo only within walls of stone until death claimed them. On parchment, the bishop cloaked his decision with theological justification. According to his reasoning, walling the women alive would grant them time for penitence, space for reflection, an opportunity for redemption through suffering before meeting their Maker. The documents, deliberately written in careful and sanctimonious language, presented the punishment as a form of divine mercy. But the truth was plainer: it was a death sentence. A mass murder hidden beneath the veil of religious purification. Still, secrecy was essential. Soldiers could not march openly to the convent without drawing the eyes of the people. Instead, the bishop constructed an elaborate deception. Rumors spread among the locals that the convent was undergoing a strict spiritual reform. The nuns, it was said, were to be placed in complete isolation for a period of reflection and renewal. No visitors allowed, no contact with the outside world. At the same time, laborers were discreetly hired under the pretense of carrying out renovations. Stones, mortar, and tools were brought in as though the convent were being repaired, modernized, improved. But no renovations were ever intended. The stones were meant not to build, but to seal. At first, the Sisters of St. Magdalene accepted the changes with quiet curiosity. The Mother Superior, Sister Caterina, seemed strangely serene. Workers later claimed that she spoke openly of change being inevitable, of the need to submit to divine will. Whether she knew the true nature of the bishop's plan or not, her words carried an eerie resignation, as though she foresaw the doom awaiting her and her sisters. The trap was ready. The stage was set. And the night of June 15, 1811, would be the final night the Convent of St. Magdalene ever breathed freely. The final evening descended upon the Convent of St. Magdalene with a silence that was far from ordinary. June 15, 1811, a date soon to vanish from the living memory of the Church, but one forever etched into the hidden pages of its history. The nuns followed their daily routine, but witnesses later recalled that something in the air felt heavier that night. The courtyard, usually alive with the soft murmur of communal prayers, was empty. The customary evening chants, which once echoed through the stone cloisters, never rose. Instead, the women retreated to their quarters earlier than usual, as though some unspoken awareness pressed down upon them. From a distance, workers and guards assigned to watch the convent reported flickering lights in the upper windows, candles burning far past midnight. Some believed the nuns were holding a vigil, perhaps sensing what awaited them. Others whispered that it was not prayer, but one final night of their secret rites. Sister Caterina herself was seen wandering alone through the stone passages of the convent. Her footsteps echoed softly in the stillness, and one laborer, hiding in the shadows, swore he heard her speaking aloud, not in Latin, not in German or French, but in a language he did not recognize. Fragments of her words drifted through the night air, part prayer, part invocation. Whether she was speaking to God, to her sisters, or to something older and unseen, none could say. And then dawn came. On June 16, as the first light of morning touched the horizon, the convent's great bell rang out a solemn toll that would be the last sound the outside world ever heard from St. Magdalene. The bishop arrived at sunrise, flanked by 2 trusted priests and a detachment of armed men disguised as additional workers. His plan was already in motion. There would be no turning back. All of the nuns were summoned to the convent's main hall. There, in a voice that carried both authority and deception, the bishop read aloud a document, a papal proclamation. It was a forgery, written by his own hand, but to the nuns it bore the weight of holy command. The words declared that their convent had been corrupted, that demonic forces had taken root within its walls, and that only through the supreme sacrifice of isolation could true purification be achieved. The reaction was divided. Some of the younger sisters collapsed in tears, pleading for mercy. Others stood frozen in silence, their faces pale with fear. Yet a smaller group, the older women, those who had walked closest with Sister Caterina in her secret practices, did not resist. They lowered their eyes, as though this fate was something they had long anticipated. Only one voice rose to challenge the bishop. Sister Caterina stepped forward. Calm, composed, she faced the man who held their lives in his hands. Her words, later preserved in the reports of the priests, were simple yet defiant. Your Excellency condemns what you do not understand. What you call heresy, we call truth, a truth older than your faith. But I bow to God's judgment, not yours. Her statement was twisted by the bishop into a confession of guilt. In his eyes, her words sealed the fate of all 80 women present. The order was given. The nuns were escorted back to their chambers, locked within, instructed to remain in prayer and repentance as the works of purification began. Outside their doors, the masons and workers set to their grim task. One by one, the exits were bricked over. Stones and mortar sealed windows, doors, corridors, every opening that connected the convent's breath to the world outside. At first, the sounds from within were desperate. Screams, sobs, and cries for mercy echoed through the halls as the realization spread like wildfire. Some women beat their fists against the doors, others hurled themselves at their barred windows, splintering wood but unable to break through the thick stone. Their pleas carried faintly to the ears of the workers, who labored faster, fearful of the voices rising behind the walls they were building. But as the hours stretched on, the tone shifted. The screams began to fade, replaced by chanting. Not the hymns of the church, not the Latin psalms that should have filled a convent, but strange and ancient melodies. The sounds seemed to resonate with the very stones, unsettling even the hardened laborers. Some workers begged the bishop to let them abandon the task, disturbed by the unnatural cadence of the voices within. But the bishop, unwavering, insisted that the heretics' final cries were proof of their corruption. The walls must continue to rise. Stone by stone, hour by hour, the convent was transformed into a tomb. As the day of June 16 wore on, the Convent of St. Magdalene became less a holy sanctuary and more a living grave. The walls rose steadily, shutting away light, air, and hope. The nuns inside, realizing the truth of their fate, shifted from panic to despair and from despair to something stranger. The workers later recalled the sequence of sounds with chilling clarity. At first, it was chaos: fists hammering against doors, shrieks of terror, the muffled crash of furniture being thrown against sealed windows. Pleas for mercy rang out, cries directed to God, to the bishop, to anyone who might listen. But as the stones closed in and the air grew thin, the voices changed. What replaced them was not silence, not yet. It was chanting. Not the familiar hymns of the Catholic faith, but something older, stranger. Voices joined in unison, rising and falling in patterns no Christian ear could comfortably recognize. The tones were raw, primal, echoing like an ancient liturgy meant not for heaven, but for something beneath the earth. Some laborious grew pale, crossing themselves as they worked. A few whispered that the voices did not sound like human singing at all, but like the walls themselves were beginning to hum. Fear spread among the men. Several abandoned their tools outright, refusing to return even under the threat of excommunication. But the bishop remained unflinching. To him, these unnatural chants were evidence enough that the convent was truly infested with heresy. The sealing must continue. By nightfall, the outer walls were complete. Yet faint sounds still drifted through: chants, cries, perhaps even prayers. The bishop ordered a second barrier built, another layer of stone, thicker and denser, creating an empty cavity between the first and second walls to smother whatever remained inside. It was during the construction of this second wall that the most terrifying event of all occurred. Around midnight, when exhaustion weighed heavy on the workers and the last stones were being laid, all sound from within suddenly ceased. The abruptness of the silence was shocking. Men dropped their tools, straining to listen. For a moment, it seemed as though death had already claimed every soul inside. Then it began. A voice. A woman's voice. Clear, strong, resonant, yet no one could identify from where it came. It did not sound as though it came from behind a single door or window. The workers swore the voice emanated from the stone itself, as though the walls, newly built, had begun to sing. The language was unrecognizable. Some said it was Latin twisted into strange shapes, others claimed it was older still, a tongue forgotten by history. The melody rose and fell, weaving through tones that made the hairs on the men's necks stand on end. One worker later described it as the voice of all the dead in the world crying out at once. Another insisted it was older than Christianity, older than Rome, older than even the stones that formed the convent itself. Whatever it was, the effect was devastating. Hardened men who had worked through famine and plague dropped their tools and fled into the night, refusing to return even under threat of eternal damnation. Some wept openly, swearing that what they had heard was not of this earth. But the bishop, cold and resolute, interpreted it differently. To him, this was the ultimate proof of demonic presence, a final, desperate attempt by dark forces to resist their confinement. Far from terrifying him, the sound only reinforced his conviction. In his eyes, he had been chosen as the hand of God to seal this evil once and for all. The work continued. By dawn on June 17, the last stone was set. The Convent of St. Magdalene, once a living community of 80 women, had been transformed into a mausoleum. Every door, every window, every breath of air had been blocked with stone and mortar. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. And silence. The silence of 80 voices extinguished forever.